King Solomon, a reign of peace. We're getting a little further into it tonight. Lord, I pray that as we open your word, that you would open our hearts. That as we come before you, that we would see Jesus and know your great love for us, see your glory. Give us ears to hear, give us wisdom, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. 1 Kings chapter 3. We're reading to verse 3 from the first verse.
Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her into the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall around Jerusalem. The people were sacrificing at the high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places.
We had looked at last week into the dream that Solomon had, and also to that experience that these two women both had a baby, one died, and now here they are fighting over this living baby as to whose baby it is. They both know who the baby belongs to, but the mother whose baby died isn't willing to be without a child. So she wants this one. So with that in mind, keeping that in mind, because we're going to revisit that tonight, elements of that. What is the prelude to the dream that Solomon has?
Pharaoh's daughter.
He married Pharaoh's daughter, which we're going to explore in just a moment, but that's not really what the text says. What does it say at the very beginning?
He made an alliance with Pharaoh.
All right, he made an alliance with Pharaoh. That's what we read in English, right?
Mm-hmm.
What other ways does it say in your translation? He made an affinity with Pharaoh. All right, anything else? Does it say anything else? He made a marriage alliance, is what it says in other translations. Here's literally what the Hebrew says. It's Solomon married Pharaoh. That's literally how the Hebrew reads. Now you might say, all right, that sounds odd. And it is. Now, when it reads that literally, a Hebrew reader would read that and know that it doesn't mean he literally married Pharaoh. As we have figures of speech, we understand when we see a figure of speech what is being spoken about. Nevertheless, this is what it says. Solomon married Pharaoh, or married into Pharaoh, is the implication that is being given there. It refers to intermarriage. Now,
It's not the same word as just marry. It's related by marriage.
It's become related by marriage, but the literal indication there is that Solomon married Pharaoh. So if you just look at a lexicon, it's not going to give you that sense. It's not possible to look up a Hebrew English dictionary. It's not going to give you that sense. Now, this is the prelude to the dream that Pharaoh has. It's the marriage, literally then, to the daughter of Pharaoh. All right? Now we're going to look at some connections with the daughter of Pharaoh and where it harkens back to something else in the Torah. Remember, the Torah is what section of the scriptures? The first 5 books. So that would be which books? Which ones are they?
Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers.
And Deuteronomy. So quiet voices. So I'll get you to speak up when you speak so that everybody online will be able to hear us. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So we're going to be seeing where we're getting echoes of this, these accounts in the Torah, primarily in the book of Genesis. We'll see some in the book of Exodus as well. But we're going to be visiting Genesis throughout our time this evening, once we're ready to get to that. Now, how do I want to do this? In Deuteronomy chapter 7, so I left a space in front of Pharaoh intentionally, because that would be Solomon married into Pharaoh. His intention and his desire was not so much Pharaoh's daughter as much as it was to marry into the connection he'd get with Pharaoh. All right? Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verse 3. Now, before we read this, in the first couple of verses of chapter 7, there are 7 nations that are mentioned here in the land of Canaan. And Moses is giving instruction to the people. They're getting ready to go into the promised land, which is Canaan. He says, so when the Lord your God gives them over to you, then don't make any covenant with them. Don't make agreements with them. You're to be separate from them. And then we get verse 3. Go ahead.
Oh, I thought it was Debbie, sorry. Do not intermarry with them, and do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons.
Now this word intermarry is the same word that we're getting in 1 Kings 3. Intermarry, it's marrying into. So it's a marriage connection that is being derived. So intermarriage. And what is the context that the Lord is giving this to the people of Israel in?
In the wilderness.
All right, so they're in the wilderness. What else?
They're about to go into their promised land.
All right, about to go into the promised land. The Lord gives some distinctions about them. In verse 6, what does he tell us? And what I'm going to get you to do is you can go ahead and read it and then paraphrase these couple of questions that we look at, all right? What do we find out about the people of Israel? What are they?
They're holy.
They are holy. And Moses tells them that God has chosen them from among the people, from all of the other nations. And he tells them why. It wasn't because they were more numerous or because they were stronger. He chose them because they were the fewest of all the people. He set his love on them, and he's keeping the oath that he made to their fathers. In other words, who are the fathers that he made the oath to? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So this is all about what? Covenant, right? It was through the Exodus that the descendants of Abraham, then through Isaac and then Jacob, and then ultimately through Jacob, they became known as what? The Hebrews, and then ultimately the Israelites. So they became known as the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Israel. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, as you will recall. But they don't become distinct as a nation until they come out of Egypt. It's the Exodus that turns out to define them as a nation. And that will take place primarily through the parting of the Red Sea, leaving Egypt, and coming to Mount Sinai, where a covenant is ratified with them. So God is going to meet the people of Israel on Mount Sinai. And it'll be at that point that they become identified as it were, as a nation. What is taking place at Mount Sinai is basically a marriage contract, a marriage covenant. Contract is the wrong, a marriage interaction between Israel and God. So here we are now in Deuteronomy chapter 7. How many years later after that? 40 years later. All right. He reminds them that God brought them out of slavery, and he's faithful. He keeps covenant. This is in verse 9 with those who love him. Now, be careful in verse 11 to do the commandments and the statutes and the rules that I command you today. So that's part of the context that this is taking place in. They're getting ready to go into the promised land, but Moses is reminding them that they are a covenant people. They are a holy people. They're set apart. They're separate. They're not to be identified just as commoners or like everybody else, because they're not everybody else, right? God has distinguished them. He's called them as his own. Was this an exclusive thing for Israel alone? It was intended for them to be a what? A light to the nations. That they would be a blessing to the nations. And so that other nations could come and experience, to know God. But that ultimately did not take place. Remember Jonah? Several hundred years later. And Jonah, what's his story in 30 seconds? What's his story?
Got swallowed up by a fish.
All right. That's 5 seconds. Got swallowed up by a fish. Okay, great.
The end.
So it's a great fish. The scriptures don't say a whale, but a great fish. But why? Why did that happen? Because God told him to go to Nineveh.
He didn't want to.
Didn't want to go. Why?
He didn't like them.
Okay, he didn't like them. Let's boil this right down. Basically, he felt that the exclusive relationship that Israel had, or the relationship that Israel had with God, which at that point in their history was waning. In other words, it was becoming very poor. But they felt it was an exclusive relationship meant for the people of Israel alone and nobody else. But God was showing not only Jonah, but the people of Israel that God's dealings is not just with them, but intended to be to all of the nations. And so that's why God had commissioned Jonah to go to Nineveh. Now the message, what was the message that God told Jonah to bring to the people of Nineveh?
Straighten up.
Straighten up, you die.
They had so many days to do it too.
Repent. 40 days, 40 days and judgment is coming. 40 days and judgment is coming. Well, he's hoping that the 40 days go fast because he wants to see the demise of the people of Nineveh. But what happens? God spares them. The king and all of the people, they repent in ashes, sackcloth and ashes. Even the king commanded that even the animals were to be clothed in sackcloth. This was to be an expression. I mean, you can't prevent an animal from eating, right? It's just going to eat. He's going to graze. But do you see the heart of the king on behalf of the people to lead his people in repentance, that perhaps God would spare them? And when day 40 comes and turns into the next day, and there's no fireball from heaven, there's no nuclear explosion, and the people are still alive, what did Jonah say? Okay, before that. Isn't this what I told you before I left? This is why I didn't want to come. Because you are God who is full of Hesed. Remember? Covenant promises. Well, wait a minute. Covenant promises, these people aren't part of your, these are not part of your people. How do they benefit from your covenant? It's because his covenant was intended to go to all of the nations through people of Israel. That's why the gospel was to be given to the Jew first and then to the Gentiles. So here we have the people of Israel, Deuteronomy chapter 7, they are told, don't intermarry with the nations you're about to encounter when you come into the land. This is still in the same context back in chapter 6, in verse 4. Without looking, see if anybody knows what this is. I'm going to say the first word, hear. O Israel, the Lord your God
Is one.
is one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. And in the Hebrew, it's 3 times the name of the Lord. So we'll look at in the, I guess in the English, the way we quote it, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. This is what the Jews will pray every day. Many of them, observant Jews anyway, even still today. And then he says, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, and strength. And then he says that you are to obey all of the words that I have given to you, and you're to speak to them, of them, to your children. In all that you do, you're to instruct your kids that you are a distinct people. So look at verse 10 of chapter 6.
And when the Lord our God brings you into the land that he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, to give you with great and good cities that you did not build.
And it's going to continue on, but I want us to focus on this aspect. When the Lord your God brings you to the land that he swore to your fathers. What does that mean? That he's fulfilling the promise. Now go down to verse 15. And we'll continue with you, Todd, if you don't mind.
For the Lord your God...
16, sorry. 16. Is that what I want? 15.
For the Lord your God in your midst is a jealous God. Lest the anger of the Lord your God be kindled against you, and he destroy you from off the face of the earth.
So they're being told, don't go after other gods. That's the verse before it. The Lord your God is jealous. He's bringing you into a good land, the land that he swore to give to their forefathers. Over and over again, they're being reminded that God is a God of covenant. He's a God, he's a promise-keeping God. So 400 years did not get in the way of preventing God from keeping his promise. Church, 2,000 years has not and will not keep God from keeping his promise, fulfilling his word. 6,000 years will not keep him from performing all that he said he would do. So then he says, when your son asks you, this is in verse 20 now. What's the meaning of all of these testimonies, statutes, and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? You shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's what? Slaves in Egypt. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. So, look down in verse 24. The Lord commanded us to do all of these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as we are this day. It will be righteousness for us if we are careful to do all this commandment before the Lord our God as he has commanded us. All right. So how are they distinguished? They are covenant people. They've entered into a covenant relationship with the God of creation, the God who made a promise to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The promise was initially made to Abraham. It was ratified or reiterated to Isaac, and once again reiterated to Jacob, and ratified on Mount Sinai. These are the distinguishing marks and characteristics that the people of Israel are to be known by, that they do not intermarry. But what do we see here about Solomon? What does he do?
Marries,
He intermarries right from the very get-go.
but it's not with the nations that were supposed to.
Okay, so it's not of the 7 nations. Not of those 7 nations of Canaan. The prohibition was that they were not to intermarry with anyone besides themselves. So here is only one place of many. Here it speaks of 7 nations. Others, there'll be different prohibitions. It'll be against Moab. It'll be against Egypt. There will be various places where they'll be told, do not intermarry with the nations around you, because they will lead you astray. They'll take your heart and lead it away from you. So here we have Solomon. And he intermarries, or he marries into Pharaoh. What's the significance of that, of telling us that piece of information? It's one verse. Why does he bother telling us that in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 1? Why isn't it elsewhere, maybe when he says about that he built a house for his wife, who's the daughter of Pharaoh? That's going to be later. So he says he's going to do that. Why not mention that then? Right? Oh, by the way, he married Pharaoh's daughter and he built her a house. He's going to speak about that. But the Holy Spirit gives that information to us right here. He's been coronated, so he's now the king. He's carried out some judgments against those who have stood against his father David. Peace is now in the land. And the Lord, he's going to worship God at Gibeon. That's at the tabernacle, right? So we're keeping in mind where some of these locations are and how some of these things fall into a bit of a timeline. He's worshiping in verse 4 of 1 Kings 3. So he goes to Gibeon. And he's making sacrifice there. That's where the tabernacle is. And it's while he's there that he has this dream. God tells him, ask for anything that you want and I'll give it to you. Why do we have this prelude about Pharaoh's daughter? What is that there for?
Is it an expression of Solomon's heart?
An expression of his heart? Well, let's have a look. In verse 3, it says Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father.
But he didn't keep that command.
Oh, okay. He didn't keep that command. All right. Do you remember looking down when he looking to see how I want to deal with this, getting my thoughts arranged for a moment. My head is swimming with all kinds of stuff, so just trying to sort out how I want what sequence I want to deal with this. When Solomon has the dream and he asks the Lord for, what did he ask God for, first of all? He asks for wisdom. Okay, let's have a look at, verse 9. A discerning heart. Well, that word discerning is literally a listening heart. What's that?
Shema.
Exactly.
The
Ian?
Hebrew.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter. All right, we'll do.
I know you're practicing, but the rest of us don't.
So,
It's like
a listening heart.
Kate could have written that.
Well, you possibly could have. I don't know. So he's asking for a listening heart. And what does God tell him? He says that in verse 10, it pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. God said to him, because you have asked for this and not asked for yourself long life or riches or the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right, here's what I'm going to do. According to your word, I'm going to give you a what? Verse 12. Give you
A wise and discerning heart.
a wise and a discerning heart. And then in verse 13, I will also give you what you've not asked, riches and honor, so that no other king compare with you all your days. Do you know that of all of the kings of Judah, all the kings of Israel, none of the kings of Israel, the northern kingdom, after the split, all right? When did the split happen? Who's that guy?
He is the son of Solomon.
All right, so let's look at him for just a moment. Solomon has a son, Rehoboam. After Solomon dies, Rehoboam takes the throne, and during his reign, the kingdom is divided. Northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah. And in the northern kingdom of Israel, there would not be even one godly king. In the southern kingdom of Judah, there would be a few godly kings, but not many. And the majority of them became idolaters. One of the reasons was because they married into the nations around them, and their hearts were led astray. With that understanding, even with King Saul, who was the king of Israel to begin with, and then you get David, and then Solomon. Did anybody write any scriptures? Did any kings write the scriptures? Well, we've got David wrote a lot of Psalms.
Yeah.
He did.
He wrote half of the Psalms. Is that scriptures?
Yeah.
All right, so David wrote half of the Psalms. Did anyone else write scriptures? Any other kings write scriptures?
Solomon.
Solomon, what did he write?
Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, some Psalms, Solomon.
That's the same thing. The last two are the same thing.
Okay.
You said some of the Psalms.
Some of the,
Some of the Psalms.
oh,
Yeah,
I thought you said Song of Songs and Song of Solomon. I'm sorry.
It's all right. I should have said it differently, but anyway.
All right, I think we're clear now. So he's written Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, or Song of Songs, and some of the Psalms. Now, there's no other king that has ever had that kind of input. But his heart is going to be led astray. Now, when we looked at these aspects, what Solomon gets, wisdom and understanding, and he also, on top of all of that, he gets riches and so on. Who was that like unto that we looked at last time we were together? Joseph. And Joseph, he received that under what circumstance? How did he get, how was he described? How was it that he was described as a man with wisdom and understanding? Interpreted dreams, and specifically which dream that this this was declared in. Pharaoh's dream. All right. And we looked at some elements of Pharaoh's dream that are similar to what is going to be seen here with these two women and their babies. Remember we looked at that? So there's some similarities going on regarding that. We'll look at a bit more of that tonight. Looking back at Joseph, he is factored into some of these things that in his rule, because he had a rulership, right? He was second in command of all of Egypt. And Egypt was the world power of the day. So what do we see of a comparison with Solomon marrying the daughter of Pharaoh and Joseph?
Solomon is like the second in command of Pharaoh.
Solomon is in the second command of Pharaoh? All right. Not quite.
No, I know.
Joseph stayed away from Pharaoh. Wanted him.
So that'd be Potiphar's wife. Let's go back
He married a
to Genesis chapter 41. Let's look at verse 45.
Fair. I wonder you got mixed up.
Who gave John the hard names? Honey?
Oh, I gave you the hard names, John.
Yeah.
Here, let me spare you. If you don't.
Zaphani.
All right, so
Zaphanath.
in verse 45, Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah. How's that for a mouthful?
And he gave him to the wife as Nath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt.
All right. So, we're in Genesis 41, 45. Now, Solomon married the daughter of Pharaoh. Joseph married the daughter of? Exactly.
Priest of On.
There's a very close similarity. I'm just putting it as Potiphera instead of Potiphar. Potiphera. In the Hebrew, without getting into the details of it, Pharaoh and Potiphera, these are two separate words. And Pharaoh is almost identical to Pharaoh when you write it out in the Hebrew. Joseph married the daughter of Potiphera. Solomon married the daughter of Pharaoh. But there's something interesting that takes place. What do we see in the very next verse, verse 46? What did Joseph do? How is it described? What did he do? After he married this lady, what did he do?
He entered the service of the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Out from his presence and traveled throughout Egypt.
All right, so he went out throughout Egypt. So there's indication that he's just going out. He's not sticking around at home and dealing with that marriage. He saw there was responsibilities to go out and take care of. We read that Solomon married the daughter of Pharaoh, and what did he do? Not yet. That won't be until chapter 7.
He brought her to the city of David.
He brought her into the city of David.
To live with him?
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
to be living with him.
Yeah.
Yeah. So bring the detail. I mean, obviously, Joseph is going to be living with his wife, but the details then is focused. He's married her, but all is given is that, all right, they're married, that's it. He goes out in throughout all of Egypt. He takes care of business. The very next thing we read after Solomon marries the daughter of Pharaoh what does he do? Then he takes it upon him to bring her into the city of David. What's in the city of David? What is it?
Is that the temple?
Not
No,
yet.
the-
He's going to build the temple.
David's temple of worship.
David's temple or tabernacle, his tent. David's tent, which houses what? What's in the tabernacle, the tent of David? The Ark of the Covenant, which represents the very presence of God. Now, we discover in where we first began, he brings her into the city of David, and the people were sacrificing at the high places. However, the people were sacrificing at the high places, however. Why? Because there was no temple yet. So it's interesting. There's no house for God, and there's no house for his wife. And what's he going to do? It's like there's this tug of war going on. There's this picture where there's God and there's Pharaoh, although it's Pharaoh's daughter. But what is Solomon's desire? What is his design in marrying his daughter? It's Pharaoh. It's that intermarriage. It's that alliance that's going on. That's what we're reading. It was made a marriage alliance. And it's like there's this tug of war being pictured for us. You're looking quizzical and wondering where this is going. You'll see it as we come along.
It's a lot. You're talking so fast.
All right, I'll turn the dial down to half that speed. We don't see the house of God taking place or coming into being built until we get into chapter 5. We don't see a house being built for his wife, the daughter of Pharaoh, until chapter 7. Oh, excuse me, not chapter 7, until after chapter 7. It's in chapter...
Solomon built his palace. in
Yeah, that's
7.
chapter 7 is the palace. And in chapter 11. I think that was... no, I don't think it's there.
Is it in Chronicles?
No, I think we're in King. It's still being Kings, but my mind is drawing a blank on that. If you find it, if it comes to you, then we'll take care of it. It's not that important for us to see, except to pardon me.
7,
It is chapter 7.
verse 1. 1 Kings 7:1. Solomon built his own house 13 years, and he finished his entire house.
No, there's a house that he built for the daughter of Pharaoh.
Yeah, I remember reading it, like, oh, that's so cool, he built her her own house.
Okay, it is 7, verse 8. All right, so he builds his own house. Then it says in verse 8, his own house where he was to dwell in the other court, back of the hall, was of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken in marriage. Right? What we see with the picture of these two mothers is what is going to be how God is going to use this incident to show Solomon, take care of your heart, guard your hearts. Because there's going to be a tug of war, and we see elements of what's going on with the same phrasing and similar elements going on with the story of Joseph. Who does Israel belong to? God. But there can be this idea that, looking back at Joseph, who is the idea that the people of Israel would end up belonging to? Egypt. Pharaoh said, these people need to be mine. I need to control them. I need to rule over them. And remember, Egypt is sort of a picture of what? The The world. Yes? And the world's claim or draw hold on us. And so that's why the Exodus is such a benchmark. I mean, when we look back at, you talk to any Jew, you say, what is the defining moment in your history, looking at the Bible? Not recent history, because then they're going to look at, any secular Jew is going to say what? 1948, when they became a nation, once again. But you say, biblically speaking, in the Bible, what is the defining moment in Israel's history? And they will say, the Exodus. Hands down, the Exodus, right? Hands down. And even today, they still celebrate the Passover, even today, because it was a defining moment for them to never forget and always remember what God did. Now, many will just follow through on those traditions and not really pay attention to all of the supernatural aspects of it. Nevertheless, Pharaoh wanted to take Israel and had taken Israel as his own. And what did God tell Moses when he saw him at the burning bush? He tells Moses to go and speak to Pharaoh, let my people go. And otherwise, besides that, let's look at Exodus 4 for a moment. Verses 22 and 23. Exodus 4, 22 and 23. Carolyn, please.
Then say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go, so he may worship me. But you refuse to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son. And 24?
No, that's good right there, thanks. So the Lord lays claim to Israel as his firstborn son. It's his child, right? Israel belongs to me, but you have claimed him for your own. But he mistreated his son. As a matter of fact, what did Pharaoh command be done? All of the baby boys, what do they do? What's to be done to them? To kill them. So we're going to be seeing some aspects of this pictured in Solomon's wisdom. Remember we said last time together, why is it that this is used of these two mothers with their children, one dead and one alive? And the ruling that Solomon makes, that is what's chosen to highlight his wisdom. Why is that here? And why is it in this context? With Pharaoh marrying Pharaoh's daughter, being given wisdom, discerning heart, and these things connecting back to Joseph and Pharaoh, which really predates and starts to define the relationship of the people of Israel in Egypt, right? So let's look at one more thing in 1 Kings chapter 3 before we start making some strong connections with Genesis. 1 Kings chapter 3. We looked at this last week, or last time we were together. It's 2 weeks ago now. So 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 8.
Your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people who cannot be counted for multitude.
A great people. I showed it to you on the board last time. I'm going to show it to you on the screen for ease so that we can see it now. You're not going to be able to read it. simply because it's in Hebrew. But this is 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 8, what Johnny just read. So great nation. The word that is given to us there for great is this word right here, great nation, okay? Rav, or great people. Is people, Rav is great. And what's going to be, you're going to have to click it a few times in order to, so we'll get it again, please. All right? So this is the centerpiece of verse 8. And it's what shows what's coming ahead, a warning for Solomon, because God is giving him great what? Wisdom and understanding. Because he's asking for a listening heart, because he doesn't know how to rule, how to lead these people. So he needs a list. He said, I need a listening heart. He speaks about this great nation. All right? So great. This is people. This is the people right here, okay? The Alm. So the one that's highlighted in the white box now. And this is what we are seeing. An Alm is the nation or the people. Let's have a look at the next slide. So we've got just Alm. Now look to the left and look to the right of that. Okay? So there's the Rav that we've already mentioned, and then this word here, which we're not going to get into the pronunciation and so on, but we're going to be seeing these words in just a moment. Let's have a look at this Alm, okay? A people. Then we've got, we'll click it again. We've got what is an R, basically, and then we've got the what is a B or a V, depending on the usage. So here, we'll click it again. We see that we've got it highlighted, the R and then the B, and then we've got this one, which is the A, and then we've got an M. And that's what we wind up with here, which is the word or the name. What word do we have there?
Jeroboam.
Jeroboam. How does that fit in? Where does this word or name Jeroboam come?
Later with his son Rehoboam.
And not only with his son, but Solomon is going to have interaction with both Jeroboam and Rehoboam. It's not just when Solomon's off the scene. So we'll deal with that when we get there, but just so that we see that here we have a hint for Solomon. Need to be aware of this, need to be alert. Let's have a look at this next part. So again, we have the Alm, okay? That's our centerpiece. So we're going to be highlighting these letters in order. So we've got the R, and then we've got the H, and then we've got the B or the V, and then we've got the A, and then the M. Which, any guesses whose name that would be?
Solomon's?
Starts with the R.
Oh, Rehoboam.
Rehoboam, so we can put that on there. So we've got Jeroboam to one side and Rehoboam to the other side. This is hinting at what could possibly take place in the future. Now, Solomon, can he know the future? No. Can God speak words? Can he give indication? Look at your past. Look at what happened in Israel's history so you can avoid reproducing that in your own day. Okay, so that's what God is basically bringing to Solomon here. That's a hint at it, but he's going to show him in a picture with these two mothers. All right, so let's come back to our screen. Let's have a look at this Alm Rav. Do you remember what an Alm Rav was?
Great nation.
Great nation or great people. What does Joseph say about a great people? Let's go to Genesis chapter 50. And verse 20. Genesis 50 and verse 20. Debbie, are you at that?
Yeah.
Could you read that for us?
But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people.
All right, so much people. That's that Am Rav. Many people. To save many people alive. Now, this isn't just applying to his brothers, right?
Right.
Because this is all Egypt as well. So he reminds his brothers that although they did evil, God has a greater plan, and he will use people's poor choices, even that he can turn around for his glory and to bring about good to work out good for people that will trust in him. Now, what did God do with Joseph in order for him to keep these people alive?
Prime Minister of Egypt.
Made him prime minister. And what did he end up doing as prime minister?
Stored all of the grain and stuff. And when the droughts came and stuff, they were able to give it to the people when they paid them and stuff.
All right. So this was the dream that Pharaoh had. We read about it in chapter 40. And Pharaoh had a dream. There were 7 what?
Cows.
7 healthy, sleek, fat, or not sleek, but fat, plump, healthy, strong. And they were standing in the Nile. And the phrasing that is there is very similar to these women. It says the women stood before Solomon. We see phrasing that is paired together that is not found elsewhere throughout the Old Testament. So we're seeing that there's pairs and parallels that are going on that line things up even more than that. Does anybody remember how 1 Kings chapter 3 with the mothers and the babies are connected to Pharaoh's dream and Joseph's interpretation of that? There are weekly readings in the scriptures, in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, called Parsha readings. And the section that is being dealt with Pharaoh's dream right through to his brothers coming, so 40 through 44, that's the reading for that week. And then they'll have, pardon me? Oh, sorry. Then they'll have other readings that are paired with that usually are from the prophets, but sometimes from the writings. And in this instance, on occasion, depending upon the year, this portion, 40 through 44, gets paired with, anybody know? Anybody remember?
Kings.
1 Kings chapter 3, verse 15, on through to chapter 4, the first part of chapter 4 verse 1, I think it is. Which is, it's all about, you won't see it in that as far as the Haftorah. You won't see 1 Kings in that. What I'm referring to there is a schedule, a Torah reading schedule that Debbie is looking at that shows the Torah and the Haftorah. But the 1 Kings chapter 3 only is paired with it when it's an off year, when they add an extra month to the year, so that it gets paired then. So it's not just that we're looking at parallels of phrases that are found in only those 2 accounts, but we see that even the scribes, the Jewish scribes from of old, have seen the parallels to pair them together. So it's not just that, well, let's throw in here this illustration of Solomon's wisdom. God is using this, is highlighting this for Solomon, said, don't get caught in the trap that your forefathers got caught in. And so what is that? We see that there were the 7 strong, healthy cows. Then there were 7 sleek and ugly and thin and gaunt. And what did they do? They ate the 7 healthy cows, but they didn't look any bigger, any stronger. Went back to sleep. Then he has another dream with stalks of corn, healthy and full of life. And then 7 gaunt and wind-scorched stalks came and devoured the 7 good ones, but they didn't look any better. He interprets it and says, both of these two are one dream, one meaning, one message. 7 good of both of these illustrations represent 7 good years, 7 plump and bountiful years. Excuse me. Immediately on the heels of that will be 7 drought-filled years, famine years. And so Pharaoh says, is there anyone else that we can see who is as wise and understanding as Joseph is, as this man? Who do we see that paralleled with? Solomon. I'm going to give him wisdom and understanding. And in whom is the Spirit of God? So God is leading Joseph. God is leading Solomon. One is going to build Joseph. He's put in charge of all of Egypt. He's only second to Pharaoh as far as the throne is concerned. So he's put in charge of this storage project. He builds storehouses all throughout the land. And what does God intend for those storehouses to do? Okay, that's what Joseph intends to do. What does God intend for the contents to do? To feed the people, to look out, to keep them alive. This is a physical need. Solomon is going to be tasked with building what? The temple. And the temple is to be for whom? Just the Israelites?
For the nation.
For the nations. Because so if any foreigner comes to the temple and prays to you, then hear their prayer. Isn't that what we saw? Yes. Two lessons ago? That God would hear from heaven. God says, I will do this. So basically, Solomon is building a storehouse of another kind, right? And it's a storehouse of food, but what kind? Spiritual food. To feed the people spiritually. And should it be at any cost involved in these things? Does God give food for people without, he says, come to me and buy without cost, he says in Isaiah chapter 55, for instance. So it's intended to be given to people. And what does Joseph end up doing? He ends up charging, and even to the point, what does he do with the people when they couldn't afford? They had no more crops left, they had no more money. Then what ultimately does he end up doing? He buys their land, and then ultimately he ends up, what's that? They became his slaves. Interesting. The Egyptians became slaves, and Joseph is basically the master over them. What will Solomon end up doing? He ends up making slaves of many of his own people. Rehoboam, when he takes the throne, the people come to him and said, would you please go easy on us? Because your father taxed us so heavily. He worked us so hard. Right? See, what were they tasked with doing? What did they work so hard in doing under Solomon? They were building the temple. Good project, right? Noble project. But after that all takes place, Solomon continues with the taxation. He continues with the work for other projects that be going on. And now it's starting to get old, right? Rehoboam, please just release some of the pressure give some relief to the constraints and the demands. And he ends up saying this in 1 Kings chapter 12. Come back to me in how many days?
3.
Back to me in 3 days, I'll give you an answer. The woman of the first baby, she had a baby, and then 3 days later, the other lady had a baby. Pharaoh has a birthday, and 3 days later, he has this dream. 3's coming up a lot, isn't it?
Yes.
What does 3 indicate in scriptures? So it's always pointing to Jesus and his death and his resurrection. How is that being pointed to in these contexts? Let's see here. I got ahead of myself on Pharaoh's dream, or on Pharaoh's birthday, 3 days later. That's dealing with the cupbearer and the baker, which, yeah.
I was like,
What?
okay.
Speak it out, because we want to make sure that we're following along with what the scripture is, right? So in all of these things, we see that his head, one was lifted up and one was restored. Speaking of a death and a lifting up, one who is elevated, resurrected in a sense. Yeah. We see that with, pardon me?
One had his head cut off, and one was restored.
Yes. What
So
did I say?
which one are you comparing the lifted up? Is that the guy that was killed or the guy that was raised up?
raised up.
The one that was raised up was the resurrection, the cupbearer.
Restored and resurrected.
Okay, sorry, I'm
Okay.
clarifying.
Speaking out.
Yep, thank you. With Rehoboam, 3, come back in 3 days. See, what are they asking him to do?
They're asking him to ease up a bit.
Release the burden, ease the burden, reduce our burden, give us relief. Well, he comes back and says, I'm not going to do it, which ends up, and he says it's going to be worse. If you thought my father was hard on you, you wait and see what I'm going to do.
Thicker than my father's waist.
Yeah. So he scourged you with whips, I'm going to scourge you with scorpions. Wow. Yay! Long live the king! What is that begging for? See, there's a contrast going on now. They're asking for burdens to be lifted, and he says, come back in 3 days, I'll give you an answer. I'm going to make burdens even heavier. What is that evoking from the people? What is that causing them to long for? For freedom, for deliverance, for a deliverer, for a true king, a king who will rule in the way David ruled, after that kind of a heart. So there's a longing for these things to be, to come into fulfillment, if you will. The next time we see Amrav is in Exodus chapter 1. And Pharaoh talks about this Amrav, this great people, this great nation. What are we going to do about them? So it's in Exodus chapter 1. I'll just read it to you. So Pharaoh said, a new king rose up in Egypt, didn't know Joseph. He said to his people, look, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Behold, the people, the Am, are too Rav. The people are great. There's many people. What are we going to do about it? In verse 20, we read that the people, they multiplied and they grew very strong. Again, we see Amrav. See, Pharaoh had determined that he's going to enslave this great people. It's like the tables are turned now, right? Joseph, he enslaved the Egyptians, but what's going on with his own family while it says that he enslaved the Egyptians? Just a few verses before that, we find out in chapter 47 of Genesis what happens to his family. They've moved now. They're living in Egypt, living in Goshen, and what does he say, I'm going to do for you? Feed you, give you bread. I'm going to make sure you've got more than enough to eat. Oh, and you Egyptians, you're going to be my slaves. Then a king rises up, didn't know Joseph, who he was, or didn't even recall to mind the things that he had done. And now he's saying, these Jews, these Hebrews, they've become a great nation. And he took matters to enslave them. Basically, the tables are turned, right? What was Solomon tasked with doing? Giving people liberty and freedom and inviting them to come and worship God. And what ends up turning against them? He enslaves them, and then Rehoboam comes along and does it even worse. And it gives a longing in the heart for the one of the good aspects of David and of Solomon that foreshadowed the Messiah who would come. Now people's hearts are crying out, may he come now. But what ends up taking place instead? After Solomon, who was told that your kingdom is going to be ripped out of your hands, he said, I'm not going to do it while you're alive for David, your father's sake. But while your son is king, that's when it will happen. And the kingdom was ripped apart. Remember, we saw the name of the garment in the Hebrew is the same letters for Solomon. And what was the division? How many tribes in each of those two nations? Do you remember?
10 was with Israel.
Well, if there's 10 in Israel, or then there's 2 in Judah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think what Judah.
Yeah.
Was it? Okay.
Think about it for a moment. The kingdom was divided 10 and 2. What was the division in Israel's family in the beginning? There were 2 favorite wives, if you will. And you've got 12 brothers. Joseph was one of them that was out of the 12, so you've got 11 and 1, but you end up with 10 and 2 ultimately. Who were they? Who were brothers? Joseph and Benjamin. Do you remember? When they came to Egypt, they didn't know who Joseph was. They came from where? Canaan? They come to Egypt. And ultimately, through course of events, we're not going to get into all of the details, that Joseph said, when you come back, make sure you bring your youngest brother with you. Because the youngest brother was his brother, his full brother. And he longed to see him. And he said, if you don't bring him back, you will not see my face. In other words, you will not get any food. So it'll be a wasted trip. Don't bother. And so they told this to Jacob, and Jacob delayed and delayed. And then he said, finally, we have to go. Go back and get some. And they said, we can't go back unless we bring Benjamin. Why did you have to tell him? He asked. He reluctantly says, I'll let you go. Now, who was it who gave his life as a surety? Judah did. Interesting. Who was the one who suggested that Joseph be sold to the Ishmaelites? Judah did. Judah suggested selling Joseph to begin with, and that's why Joseph is now in Egypt. Now he's coming back, and Joseph frames Benjamin, doesn't he? And ultimately, it's if it goes wrong and nobody defends him, then he'll send them off and keep Benjamin, and he'll say that he's going to keep him in prison. But what will he do? He won't keep Benjamin in prison. What will he do? He'll spring him, and he'll reveal himself to Benjamin, not the others, and then you'll have 2 tribes and 10 separated. A lot more going on and involved in that, and parallels that are evidenced in this event with these 2 mothers and the baby, the 2 babies. But finally, when he says, I'm keeping Benjamin, and Judah says what? I gave my word. I can't go back. My father's heart will break. Please take me instead. And at that moment, what did Joseph see? Judah proved himself. He had changed, worthy to do what? Who became, what tribe was the tribe of kings? Judah. And it was immediately on the heels of that Joseph reveals himself to all of his brothers. Up until this point, he says, is your father alive? Even on this trip, he says, is your father still alive? Is he in good health? And then after he does this, and Judah shows himself in this way, he shows himself, he reveals himself to them, and he says, speaks about the father, but how does he refer to him now? Is my father alive? Why does he had already asked on that return, is your father still in good health? Is he still alive? Now he says, is my father. Because he's identifying himself, saying, now you are my family. We're going to pick this up next time we're together, because there's going to be a part A and part B to this. We want to see how this fits together, and it's pointing to Jesus. Of the challenges and struggles that Solomon had, the shortcomings and the failings, why is he used? That God said to David, I'm making a covenant with you that your son is going to build me a house if he will obey me, walk in my ways. Did Solomon do that? He built him a house, but did he walk in his ways? No, we read in 1 Kings chapter 11 that God was displeased with him. He was going to take the kingdom and give it to another, and that would be Jeroboam.
Who proves to be a disappointment.
Pardon me?
Who proves to be a disappointment too.
Jeroboam.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, great disappointment. This picture of Amrav, we see it from the very beginning with the people of Israel. God makes a promise to Abraham and says, I'm going to make you a great nation. And you will be like, your descendants will be like the what? Sand on the seashore. It's interesting that God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding like the sand on the seashore. See, there's a connection going on here. You don't see that kind of descriptive words going on for other elements in the scripture. So we see that this is how God's covenant promise was coming into place. There'd be many who would try to accomplish and bring to pass those aspects, but there's only one who can bring them to pass, and that is Jesus. We'll pick that up from there. We'll do a short overlap so that we're reminded of just a couple of things, and we will wrap this up next time we're together.